This is kind of asking about the differences in parts from structural dissociation of something like PTSD and CPTSD versus alters that you would see in DID or OSDD. Keep in mind, I'm not a therapist or other professional, I'm just a nerd, but my understanding is that the alters that you would see in a condition like DID or OSDD is a form of structural dissociation too. It's just that structural dissociation is a spectrum. It's the same concept of parts, but how unique or how separated, how much amnesia, or if any, exists between parts is what can vary, as well as how many parts somebody has. Structural dissociation theory proposes that people with simple PTSD, like one acute trauma type PTSD, will have an ANP part, which is their apparently normal part that they spend most of their time in, and then one EP, which is an emotional part that they can go into when triggered, when their trauma is triggered. And so that type of a thing, that emotional part wouldn't have like a different name, and so we wouldn't, or like its own like complete personality with like different preferences of like foods or music or any of those kinds of things. Like, I think most people would say it's still me, but I suddenly am kind of flooded with my trauma, and the way that I cope with things may be different. The way that I perceive myself and others may be very different. And so basically, is it a different headspace? Yes. And then with complex PTSD, and I think also things like BPD, there's what's called secondary structural dissociation. And with those types of disorders, you still have just one ANP, but you have multiple emotional parts because you have multiple traumas and multiple like headspaces that you can go in depending on how you're triggered, sort of. And again, these would typically feel like they're still parts of you or versions of you, so they're unlikely to feel like they have like a completely different name or a different like life story, different personality, etc. But again, they might feel like a version of you that is not how you normally are. Something that comes to mind is just kind of in like casual language. People might say, man, he was really freaking out and he just did not seem like himself. I think that type of a thing where somebody maybe usually is really very patient, but then suddenly they kind of lose it and they like throw something, or they yell and they usually would never yell, or something like that can sometimes be a sign that they are somebody with structural dissociation, and that not quite themselves experience is them being in their EP. Some sort of trauma gets triggered and they start thinking and acting and just kind of existing in ways that is not how they normally are. And this doesn't have to be something like throwing a tantrum or being violent or anything like that. One of my own is I see a big shift in my self-confidence. So most of the, like, I'm not saying I have like great self-confidence by any means, but I kind of have like a baseline level of self-confidence most of the time. But when one of my EPs gets triggered, I can go into like a really deep self-doubt spiral. I can feel a lot of shame. I can feel a lot of regret. I can gaslight myself, other things that I don't really struggle with a ton if I'm in my ANP. And something that is a little interesting but also kind of confusing is sometimes EPs are quite integrated with our ANP, so we're very aware of them, and they might not feel super foreign to us. Like, yeah, that's not how I usually am, but I'm well aware that when I'm having a bad day, sometimes I do this thing. Like for me, that like self-doubt part would be one of those. That's it's not my like regular self, but I experience it frequently enough, and it's not terribly disorienting to me when I go into that part because it happens often enough. I'm familiar enough with it that it it just feels like almost like a mood that I can get into sometimes. But I have other EPs that are, I always feel like that sounds like I'm saying like a goofy way of saying sleepy. I'm EP. I also have EPs that are less integrated. Parts can have different levels of elaboration and emancipation. So with the emancipation of parts, the more emancipated a part is, the less it feels like you. Elaboration is sort of how complex the part is. So all of this just to say that I think when looking at PTSD and CPTSD, our dissociated parts can still feel somewhat not fully like us, but they are more like us than an alter would be, like significantly more. Emancipation and elaboration are also a spectrum on them on their own, and so an extreme, a more severe level of emancipation would be when you could get into it feeling like a truly different personality, different person.